Everyday me, everyday God. This week when I was in the kitchen, I was using a salt shaker. And at one point, this salt shaker just brought back a flood of memories from Montreal. My husband had been appointed pastor in a church in downtown Montreal. Challenging church, difficult church. And we would meet every Wednesday, a small group of us. That's all that was left in that church, big church. We would meet on a Wednesday night to gather, to pray, to listen to and ask God to be present. One Wednesday night, Michael arranged a meeting with, a disturbingly difficult parishioner, and arranged that meeting before one of the Wednesday night times of prayer. About half an hour after Michael had gone to the church, I got this terrible sinking feeling in my gut that said something's wrong, something's really wrong. And then the phone rang, and it was one of our daughters. And on the other end of the phone, it was, "Mom, you have got to come quickly. Mom, Dad's in trouble. Dad's really sick. You've got to come, Mom." As soon as I could, I got to the church, and I met our daughter out on the sidewalk. She was white as a ghost. She was trembling in fear. And she grabbed hold of me and she said, Mom, is Dad going to die?" I didn't have an answer to that. She and I ran into the church to find Michael, and we found him writhing in agony on the floor, almost paralyzed, unable to speak. But in that space, there was a cold, dark presence. I knelt down and I said, "Michael, is this spiritual?" And he moaned kind of yes. So we took care of Michael. We got him some medical help. We got him settled for the night. And you need to understand, this story is out of our comfort zone. My husband is a very intelligent, rational, British preacher, professor, pastor. We didn't have vocabulary for what was going to happen, what was happening. This was new, totally foreign to our religious experience, to our faith journey. When Michael later described what had happened in his office that night, he said that as he was talking to this very disturbing parishioner, there was a sense in which a cold presence moved into the room, and it began to overshadow him. And he felt like he was becoming smaller, and this presence was taking over. It was getting bigger and bigger, which is how our daughter had found him. It had a sense, a feeling about it, that presence, to crush, to destroy, to suck the life out of what was in the room, what was around. So after we got Michael cared for medically and as comfortable as he could be, I got another sense in my stomach, a gut feeling like we needed to pray through the church. But who would I ask? I could not ask the people that were gathering. We barely knew them. They didn't know us. And so I phoned a dear friend, Arthur, another priest in the diocese. And I said, Arthur, I explained to him what had happened. And I said, Arthur, could you come and pray through the church with me? And he said, I'm Mary Lane. I'm with you on this one. And so I met Arthur on the sidewalk outside the church late that night. Back on that sidewalk. As we turned to walk back into the church, I can't tell you what it was like thinking about going back into that building. where we had taken Michael out of. And as we were going in, I was scared. I was really scared. I thought, was my faith big enough? Would I lose my faith in God? What would happen if Michael didn't get better? What would happen to the faith of our daughters? What would they say about a God who allowed this to happen to their dad, who was a really good man? I had lots of questions, not many answers. But as Arthur and I went into the church, we went into the main sanctuary, that place where God's people meet. A safe place, place of refuge. Was it? More questions. But as we stood there getting ready to pray, Arthur dug into his pocket and he pulled out a Saltshaker. He looked really embarrassed. But he said, Elaine, there's salt and water in here. I've prayed prayers of blessing. Now, Arthur knew the historic traditional significance of sign and symbol. Salt and water. Purification, cleansing, blessing. So Arthur and I started to pray through the church. And wherever we discerned or felt a coldness or a darkness or an evil, we prayed with words, with tears. And Arthur, with liberal amounts of salt and water all over that church building. So helpful, so good. But it was then that Arthur made me promise I wouldn't tell anyone about his Saltshaker. Until this week, when I asked his permission if I could out him on his Saltshaker. And he gave me permission. And I began to ask him some questions. I said, Arthur, why did you bring the Saltshaker? And he said, I don't know. As I was hurrying out of the house, he said, I just grabbed the Saltshaker and took it with me. And I'm glad he did. Because when we're in the presence of something cold, dark, destructive, something evil, it's so slippery, it's intangible, that it is so helpful to have something concrete, something to wrap our hands around and look and say, God is about cleansing and healing. And so sign and symbol is very helpful when we are facing unknown things we've never faced before. Arthur also said, as we were praying, that little shaker didn't carry much water, Elaine. What we needed was a whole bucketful that night. And that's true. We did need a bucketful. And I don't think either of us understood what was happening. But there were times when, kind of looking at that salt shaker and holding on to it, I felt a bit like a little kid, terrified of a big barking dog and running behind Mama and Papa and clinging to them and peeking out the side and to see whether or not they would protect me. And that night I began to understand that there are times when I will cling to sign and symbol, knowing that it is Jesus who is the power behind the sign and symbol. And I can peer around behind Jesus and see what Jesus is doing. Because salt and water is a sign and symbol that the resurrection power of Jesus is life overcoming death. It's the light of the world overcoming darkness. It's the one who is love overcoming hatred. And so clinging to sign and symbol is very helpful sometimes in our journey when we are confronted with things outside our experience, when we don't have the vocabulary for it. I want to just read something from an email Arthur sent to me this week, because I think we both understood we had this much faith. I had faith the size of a mustard seed, but it was all I needed that night. Arthur said, without that initial, desperate, try anything introduction to the use of blessed water, I'm convinced that several subsequent powerful congregational moments in God's presence would never have been experienced by me or my congregation. In these convulsive global times, I believe that God is inviting us and maybe even needing us to be people who will be willing, first of all, to discern good and evil, to give voice to good and to evil, then to stand ready to fight evil, ready to step in and fight darkness alongside God. Do I have the answers to all the whys of all of this? Absolutely not. I have far more questions than I've ever had, but I also have far more faith than I have ever had. So what do we need when darkness pushes in, when that presence of evil wants to come in and crush the very life out of us? Well, I think we need three things. Number one, we need faith the size of a mustard seed to believe that the resurrection power of Jesus is sufficient, that his life overcomes death, his light overcomes darkness, and his love overcomes hatred. The second thing we need, a good friend with a Saltshaker. The third thing we need, chutzpah, to be willing to stand in the presence of darkness and evil and proclaim light and life. Even when we don't know what's going to happen, we proclaim light and life, all the while peeking out from behind Jesus' robes. May God bless you as you stand with your Saltshaker.